Welcome to this exciting evening. And actually, thank you all so very, very much. A lot of old friends amongst the crowd, particularly members of the BGCS and the RNA, of course, and quite a number can wear both hats. And of course, everyone else. I'm humbled and delighted to see you all. Now, these concessions do only concern my book collecting. There's going to be nothing about the rest of my life, which could perhaps be rather more exciting, but sorry to disappoint you in that respect. Now, as per the Oxford Dictionary, Bibliophile, remembering this is the Confessions of a Golfing Bibliophile, is if you look up in your Oxford Dictionary, is a book lover. Now, there was a time on my visiting cards I had bibliomaniac. And people used to sort of shy away and hide, which didn't really do one good at all. But if you look in your Oxford Dictionary, bibliomaniac is an enthusiastic book collector, which I think actually I am an enthusiastic, and it's been really quite a long time now. So anyway, I did change the wording on my visiting card. I'll try not to be too boring. It's quite difficult. I'm going to sort of concentrate on just 7 stories, which obviously involve the acquisition of books or a single book, but there have been a few interesting stories along the line. And if we've got time, perhaps for one, what I call ongoing saga, in other words, it's a sort of unfinished business. I've got no attempt to sort of just go through all the stuff that I've got, because I think that would quickly send you to sleep. And I think I've gathered something like 4,000 books. And I have been very selective. You might be surprised at that. But when I set off on this great journey, and it has been a great journey, my plan was to get everything published pre-1920. I mean, that's pretty much pre-First World War. And then those books published subsequent to that I'm actually interested in and would even actually perhaps read. And I, by and large, stuck to that. The one thing that I have been tempted along the lines are dust jackets, because there are some very attractive 20s and 30s dust jackets. Might be rather boring instructional. There's not a lot of room in my collection for instructional, post 20. So I bet by and large stuck with it. And it's been an amazing journey. I talk about 50 years, but actually it's sort of nearer 65 years. And it's extraordinary that my interest in golf books goes right back to pretty much my school days, but I'll just talk about that shortly. I've got a note here that my school teachers would, what my school teachers would say if they knew that I'd now got perhaps quite a world-famous library. I mean, I could perhaps imagining them thinking in terms of the golfing, making a bit of sense, but as for the library, and in fact, in many respects, I'm sorry that my rather modest education didn't ever encompass somebody finding my love of history, because that's at the end of the day what it's all about. So we're going to get cracking on that is part of the library. And if you're interested in that picture, my next project, and we're sort of into it now, is the history of the Royal Isle of Wight Golf Club, 1888 to 1962, and that is Prince Henry of Battenberg, who married the youngest daughter of Queen Victoria, and he was the captain of that club in 1894, and that picture used to hang in the clubhouse. Beneath it, I'm already going off-piste, beneath it is Murder on the Links by Agatha Christie, which I've only just acquired. And it's considered to be I think it was the 3rd book, and of course in her really early days there were very few copies printed, so it's nice. It's got precious little about golf, but they'd find the body in the bunker, I know. Anyway, so that's a shot of the library. Here's another one. And this is the library. The wife's inclined to call it the front room. But and my little granddaughter, a few years ago now, she said, "Grandpa, how did that animal get its head through the wall?" which actually, if you think about it, is really quite an intelligent comment. But another one there. So that's this is right next door to Walton Heath, and the guy who built this modest, originally one-bedroom bungalow, Mr. Rentiens, that would have looked over the first tee. So on the left is my antiquarian section. I'm inclined to sort of lay down sort of lines and limits, and stuff that's pre-1850 is considered antiquarian. Post-1850, there's an awful lot of stuff. But that's the pale-coloured book on the bottom shelf, that is the Black Acts of 1566, publishing for the first time the 1457 Act. And it was originally owned by a Mr. Nesbitt, who was a town councillor. It's been annotated. At the time, he was a town councillor in Edinburgh in 1566, and he was sent to prison because he upset the king, and then he was released. So it's got a tremendous history. But that again is off-piece. The vase in that Bernard Darwin had a daughter called Ursula, and she was a potter, and that is made by the daughter of she was Ursula Momens. So I thought that was appropriate for the library. Right, on with the story. Yeah, actually, this is really the first story. Now that is Littlehampton Golf Club, and that's where we used to holiday. And I was a junior member down there, and then I became a country member, and I went down at age about 25, so this is circa 1967. And they modernised the clubhouse, so that the old pine panel dining room had become the mixed lounge. And it was in that room that I used to sneak and look at the old books. None of my contemporaries did. So I did have this interest from way, way back. And I said to Jack Parvin, the steward, "Where are the books gone?" Oh, he said, "They've chucked them out." And in fact, he said, "They're going to be taken away on Monday by the dustman." And they're actually downstairs, ready to be taken away. So I checked out with the secretary, and he said, "Yes, of course you can have them." And young Truett the next day arrived with 2 very large empty suitcases and took the club library home. And that, I suppose, was the start of the collection. And to give you an example, that is a golfer's guide for 1897. It's got Littlehampton across the top. So I still actually have some of those books. So they were typical books that you would find in a clubhouse in turn of the century. Handbooks and some of those bound volumes of Golf magazine. And that's how it all started. Littlehampton Golf Club. But I was living at home, and I had a little bookcase in my bedroom, and that was full up, so I really didn't do much more about my book collection until I got married, and I had a house, and it had more space to put some books, and I think it was as much decorating the place as anything else. And in those days, you could buy nice early second-hand golf books for pennies, even old pennies. And our first holiday, having married, we went back to my mother's place down on the Sussex coast, and I was doing the bookshops, and I went into the Bognor Regis bookshop, and as ever, I picked up a handful of nice old books, and something made me say to this chap, "Have you got any others?" And actually, this is now, we're dealing with a sort of life-changing moment. That question had frightening significance, because he said, "Yes, I got a couple out the back." Book 1 was the Golf Book of East Lothian, 1896, for £35. Now that is not the original one was absolutely totally immaculate, but I promised when I bought a collection of books from Edinburgh years and years later from Professor Sheen's, Chiene's collection, the family got cold feet about, well, I'm not sure what great-grandpa would think of us selling these. So I said, well, I will keep it. So I have kept it. That explains why it's not such a good copy. That's the title page, which I expect some of you are familiar with. And that's the inscription. Professor John Sheen, the author's kind regards, 1897. One of the 250, but this was a presentation copy. So that was £35, and I'd never spent more than 50p on a book. The second book was Chronicles of the Black Heath Golfers, which, okay, is not quite as grand. I think it's the same, much the same. Always reckoned to be the first golf club history, 1897. And he wanted 25 quid for that one. Again, it was much better condition, but like the other one, this belonged to John Lowe. That's one of my stories that's coming out, if he's still awake. And inscribed by the author. And we know that John Lowe got to know W.E. Hughes playing golf with him as a young undergraduate at Cambridge. Anyway, he wanted £25, so we were talking about 60 quid. And I hadn't got any money at all. I'd got something called an overdraft, which some of you might be familiar with. And I thought, well, it better pay for these two books, which was slightly irresponsible. But it did encourage me to start trading in books. I wasn't very busy at Lloyd's, and the chap that I was buying some books from I thought did it really rather badly, and you never really knew what you were buying. So catalogue number 1, winter 1974, and that was the first page of my first catalogue. And I did this for, I did 12 catalogues from 74 to 84, but I got a much busier job in 1980. So really from 80 to 84, that was sort of running the whole thing down. But it was only ever an extension of my collection. I mean, I ran it as a little business. It is a registered business name, Golf Books. I used to put in the tax returns. So I always made a very modest profit to keep the thing. Oh, the hands, by the way, that's not Mrs. Truett's elegant gloved hand. It's one of those brass, like a great big sort of paper clip, and it's very good for keeping pages in place. And those are the ones that I produced over the years. But you know, it was a very, very good thing to do, and it kept me out of mischief. And it's about the only entrepreneurial thing I've ever done in my life. But honestly, I've gone backwards ever since. And this was hugely significant because back in 73, 74, I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I had no idea what was out there. But somehow or other, I got hold of a copy of The Library of Golf. This is Joseph Murdoch's book, published in 1968 by the Gale Research Company, Detroit. And that was absolutely brilliant, getting that game changer, because I could see what I was after. And that was rather nice inscription by Joe Murdoch. And of course, Joe Murdoch and I really became pretty good friends. And of course, it was Joe with Bob Coutts, who was more of a club man. They started the GCS, the Golf Collectors Society, in 1970. I joined in 1974, and I remain a member. I think one of the longest serving ones. And of course it was the GCS and our membership of that inspired 5 of us to start the British Golf Collectors Society in 1987. And it's rather super that we have Peter Crabtree just here, who was one of the 5. 3 of us survived, the other 2 were quite a bit older, and they've passed on. Tim Smart, sadly, he hasn't been very fit, so he hasn't come up, but he's still around. And actually, when I'm just giving a bit of credit to people, we do have with us somebody who's very special for me, and he came in just as they were closing the door, David Normoyle. He was the cataloguer of the Truett Golf Library in his 2nd and 3rd year at Cambridge, and he has become a great friend, and he catalogued the Truett Golf Library, and dare I say it, he's never really looked back. And I've never been so grateful. Thank you, David. Actually, I've got down here a little bit of glamour. The slide number 931, well, that was the number that the computer gave it. And by the way, I've taken all these photographs myself. Some of them are not quite as crisp, but I thought it was quite a good effort, really. And I learned how to put them onto that. What's that system?
PowerPoint.
PowerPoint, yes. Yeah, so this was a little bit of glamour, and it was the postcard. There's a little street between Charing Cross Road and St Martin's Lane in the West End of London that is solely bookshops, and I used to whiz up there at lunchtime from Lloyd's. And this particular shop was closed, and he sold a lot of what I now know was ephemera, and a lot of theatrical ephemera. And he had a postcard I now know it was an American postcard propped up in the window of just a lovely looking girl swinging a golf club. You know, it was very fashionable. So we're now talking about sort of 1905 perhaps. And he wanted either 50p or 10 shillings for it. And I thought, well, I must have that lady, because, you know, I didn't really know such a thing existed. And of course, what it did, I had to go back, special journey the next day from the city to get this postcard. And that did start a huge, huge interest in collecting postcards. Because the humble postcard, particularly the topographical ones, have served a hugely important cause, because nobody else was taking photographs of clubhouses and, okay, perhaps to a lesser extent the golf courses themselves, other than the local photographer who wanted to sell his postcards. And I finished up with a pretty huge collection, but that has all gone. But my glamour girl hasn't gone, and I'm very sorry I wasn't able to share it with you this evening. Don't know where she got to. The next story, this is leaping forward if you're following this, circa 1979. I had this lady on the phone saying, very smart sounding lady, I've got a golf book. And I thought, well, so have quite a lot of other people. And then she said, well, it's called British Golf Links, and that's a lovely, lovely book, almost perhaps the first coffee table book. And yes, she said, mine is numbered, whatever the number was. Well, at this stage, I was actually up and leaving the room and getting on the train to go up to Victoria Station, and she had a mansion flat just by Victoria Station. This was a Saturday, and her daughter was there, and her name was Lady Swan. And she said, does the name Lady Lord Purvis mean anything to you? So, some of you who've been down to Royal St George's, he's the chap over the dining room mantelpiece, and that's there he is, a hugely influential chap. And I was able to give a quick potted biography. You know, he and Henry Lamb went down to Sandwich and all that stuff, and he was very keen on ladies' golf. He chaired what became the first meeting of the LGU. And I did pretty well with this biography, and there was a short pause. And she said, yes, he was my father. It was absolutely, I was totally and utterly speechless, which it doesn't so often happen. And he said, yes, he was my father, and he was very keen. And to give you an idea, the older ones amongst you, the Colgate Palmolive at Sunningdale, late 70s, the first time all the lady pros came over here. And he said, yes, he and I were standing, I was the youngest daughter, and we were standing on the terrace of our home in Wimbledon, looking down at the bottom of the paddock where my elder sister was practicing her golf swing. And he put his binoculars down and he looked at me, this little girl, saying, ladies must play golf. And he was hugely instrumental. So suddenly I had this situation. So that, yeah, there's the coffee table, lovely, lovely book. But then in those days, if you got the really special limited edition, large paper edition, it came in a box, because you then sent it off to your bookbinder for that man to bind it up to match the rest of your library. So this book, the limited edition, 250 copies, you will never ever see two identical copies, because they've all been bound by different people. And it was in its original box. So Lady Lord Purvis had never had it. There it is, sitting in the box. Okay, the box was, you can see that it's been a bit restored, but to actually still have it in its box is extraordinary. And there it is, number 62 of 250 copies. Okay, mistakes I made. I think I was so overwhelmed. I managed to pay her a small amount of money. Now that sounds rather sort of smart aleck-ish, but she insisted upon giving me this book. But I think I parted with 25 quid or something, and she was going to give it to charity. So, but the mistake I made in my sort of confusion was not to get her to sign it, and the fact that this was Lady Lord Purvis's book. So that was a lucky break. Oh yeah, that's the title page. This concerns John Lowe. So I was playing golf at library. I was playing golf at Woking, and this is now circa 1980. And the whole collecting thing had become really, really popular, and there was more and more interest through the 80s. And I was talking to not a very pleasant steward. We had a match, Lloyd's Golf Club against the Parliamentary Golf Society, and I sort of was the last to leave, and I was talking to the steward, and he said, oh yes, we've got a library. And I thought, well, I know Woking pretty well, but I can't ever remember. But I wasn't going. So anyway, I got hold of the steward, and then, the secretary, and then in the fullness of time, I presented myself down there on a Saturday morning, and the secretary at the time said, oh well, they're the only books, you know, we don't have a library as such, but there are some books up on the top of that cabinet in my office, and these were ledgers. These were the Caddy Register and the minute books. I said, no, well, I think we're talking about published volumes. He said, we don't have anything like this. I said, well, the steward reckons you do. So we got the steward, very disgruntled, on a Saturday morning down from his flat, and he took us into the kitchen, and he showed me the upright fridge freezer, and he said, right, if you get onto the top of that, and you see the trapdoor in the ceiling, and you push that, here's a torch, and I pulled myself up through this trapdoor in the ceiling, and on the gable end, I saw these very saggy bookshelves, but somebody had gone to the trouble, and I shone my torch on the most astonishing collection of books. You know, all the sort of rarities that I'd really only ever heard about. So I did a listing of them. The attic was only about this tall, so I had a chair and I listed all the books. And I wrote them a letter. And I'm very happy, and people have seen this letter, what a club should do if they have a library of books. And in this case, they had to get the books down out of the attic, for heaven's sakes. I mean, thinking of the extremes of temperature. And you've got to build proper shelves, proper bookcases with adjustable shelving and lockable doors. You've got to appoint a club librarian. You've got to have them catalogued and listed and valued and insured and a whole host of things. But I said, if you felt unable to make these arrangements, I would be prepared to make you an offer. And they came back after a while and said, yes, it's all too much. You know, and so I made them an offer. And the next thing I heard, they were sort of touting it about. And of course, at that stage, everybody knew somebody, because all the auction houses had collectors' departments by then. And there was, you know, the golf collectors' department, and so on and so forth. And my next slightly less convincing letters, the folly of selling at auction. I mean, obviously there are some. But anyway, in the end, I was asked to come down and collect them. Which was very good, and of course I had my list, and I went up into the attic, and I checked them all off, and he told me that all the little books, these little mid-Victorian pamphlets, I mean, the first hardback golf book was Clark's Golf on an Ancient Game in 1875, because the books prior to that were just little pamphlets, and what happens to little pamphlets, they get thrown out. So he had this, so he said, when you finish up there, come to my office, and I'll give you the little books, because they've been in the safe. And he pushed this little list of books, and two were missing. You know, absolute nightmare. One was Chambers' A Few Rambling Remarks on the Game of Golf, 1860, 1865, I think it is. And, yeah, yeah, they've all got, that's right, they've all got John Lowe's names, so it didn't take much to work out that this was John Lowe's library. And John Lowe died in 1929. He was a key member of Woking, lived near Woking, and I've never had this substantiated, but I would think that the family gave the library to Woking, and I would guess that come the war, the clubhouse was requisitioned, and they went upstairs to that attic. So there are sort of four classic examples. At the top, you've got Clark's Poems on Golf, 1867, limited edition. Chambers' A Few Rambling Remarks on Golf, 1862, and that over on the left. And there were two copies of that. Farn is the Golfer's Manual, 1857, one on the right, which it contains the first instructional as well as other stuff. And then in the middle you've got Marsh's Blackheath Golfing Blaze of 1873. So there were two missing. I wasn't too concerned about a few rambling remarks because there were 2 copies, and that meant that I could have one. But gossip of golf and golfers, there was only 1 copy, and that was missing. And to give you an idea, I said, well, I can't pay you. Well, I can tell you the figure, and it's well, it is a secret, I'm doing that anyway. We're talking about a couple of £1,000, which, back in the day, so these 2 classic books, I had allowed £100 each for them. And I said, I cannot give you the full amount. Anyway, there was a real old hullabaloo. And oh, by the way, Bob Grant had looked at the books as well, and he had done exactly the same thing as I had done, and we phoned up Bob Grant. It was a Saturday, and thank goodness he was there, and he confirmed these 2 books, because Woking hadn't got a listing, you see. So I was completely off the hook, and they had a special committee meeting, and the secretary came back, Tony Riley came back saying, Philip, he said it's all far too close to home, and we're just not going to do anything more about it. Books do walk. That's actually another very good reason not to have books in clubhouses. And I mean, we've got a lovely library here, but of course it's all locked up. They don't really work. And although I was a bit upset about, that if that had been Walton, my club, selling a collection like that, I would have been a bit upset. But the fact is, I recycled the books that I didn't want or didn't need, I recycled them amongst the collectors, and they're all still out there, and they're all. So I think my conscience was quite clear. Right. Oh yes, that's the missing one. I'm going to come back to that later, so just try and remember what that one looks like. That's 1863. Right, now that's the lovely golf course of British Isles. This is another sort of coffee table job, 1910. And Peter Wright, who followed Bernard Darwin as the golf correspondent of the Times, he was researching the history of the Halford Truett. So I think we're now talking about 1984. And he came down to my library to look at some of the old record books. And we somehow got onto it, and talking about the really, really scarce, when in fact somebody only this evening has asked me, what are the missing ones? The really early issues of the Golfer's Handbook, I have never ever seen a single copy of the 1899, the 1900, the 1901. I think I'm complete from 1902, but I don't know. Anyway, he said, well, do you know what? I'm going down to see Raymond Oppenheimer. Can you remember that the Raymond Oppenheimer and Gerald Micklem really ran golf, amateur golf, after the war? They're both immensely wealthy bachelors, and they really ran golf for many, many years. Raymond Oppenheimer of the De Beers and South African Times and everything. And he said, gosh, I'm going down to see Raymond Oppenheimer tomorrow. He said, I'll tell him about those missing early handbooks. He might be able to help you. So I thought that was the end of it. And not such a long time later, I had a personal handwritten letter from Raymond Oppenheimer saying, very interested about your needing some golf books. Do come down here sometime and help yourself. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing for somebody to say to a complete stranger. I think it was just before, I didn't rush into it immediately, but I phoned him after a while, and the butler answered the phone, as they do, and said, I'm sorry, Mr. Oppenheimer's really not very well, but, looking forward to hearing from me, but do call back a little while. So I left it a little while, and a month or so, and phoned up, and I'm so sorry, Mr. Oppenheimer's in hospital. And then another month or two, his obituary appeared in the Telegraph. And I'd still got my letter saying, come down and help yourself. So I wrote to the trustees. With a copy of the letter. And yeah, they took it up very well. And they said, there was I dealt with one in London, and there was one in South Africa. And a do come down, the butler will look after you. So it wasn't actually a library as such, it was a huge, wonderful sort of living area. And there were bookcases all over the place, and I found quite a lot of golf books, and no early golfers' handbooks, needless to say. And I was really on my honour here, because I finished up with two, it wasn't a huge number, 2 stacks of books, one for my own collection and one that I would like to use for trading purposes, because I was still running my little business. And one of the books I came across was this. So it's that beautiful book, and the purist, when you've got such a beautiful, well, it doesn't really matter what sort of binding you've got, but when you've got a binding like the one that you've just been looking at, you don't mess it about and put a very expensive all-leather binding on it. It's some sort of sacrilege, actually. But this is clearly what happened, and it was signed by Bernard Darwin. And it had this original, if you remember, Harry Roundtree, illustrated with 64 pictures of the various golf courses contained in that book. But this was an original Harry Roundtree cartoon, and he did do cartoons, and he did lots of other stuff. It's a one. And and one or two of these have come up for sale. So there wasn't just this one. I think Nigel Knockley might have got one. But it was a complete mystery. And that's the next story. And actually on the way out, in the hallway, there was another load of bookcases there, and I saw another one of these leather-bound ones, and I thought, Truett, you've had quite a much excitement for one year, just leave it like that. So anyway, it all finished up beautifully, and I presented myself at the De Beers head office in the city. It was all terribly grand, and I had to present myself to the executor, and he was very happy with the arrangements, and I can't quite remember what it was, a few thousand quid. And so he said, goodness. So I said, who do you want me to make the check out to? Oh, he said, goodness me. And he had no idea what to do. The estate was worth, I think, hundreds of millions of pounds. So he said, make it out to the Cancer Research Fund. So that had a nice charitable twist at the end. Right, next story, if you're still with me still. And this is circa 1990. And this concerns somebody called John Weigel. And if there is a Carthusian golfer here, I would guess he might remember John Weigel. I think he played in the Hewitt, the Carthusian Hewitt team. And he was a bachelor, lived down at the old family home in Crowborough, played golf at Crowborough, lovely, lovely guy. And actually married Jenny, who was a headmistress in a girls' school up in London, very late in life. And I think he married her when he knew that he was dying. But they had 5 very happy years, and he'd been a very keen collector of golf books, and he'd been buying books off me, and he seemed very keen to offload some of his special books to me, because I suppose he felt that I would give them a good home. And he just asked his price, and I paid, and I can't remember, How to Play Golf by Harry Varden. A lot of people say to me, oh, do you just collect, pretending they know about book collecting? Or you just collect first editions, do you? Well, I said, actually, if you collect golf books, there really aren't many books that go to another edition, so the whole sort of first edition thing. But there were a few bestsellers, and of course this is one of them. Went to endless editions. I think the first year of publication, which was 1912. It was actually, this is a 3rd edition of 1912. I think there were 4 editions published in the first year. So it's, on the face of it, not terribly exciting, and you might be interested to know why John Weigel particularly wanted me to have it. To my great friend off the links, but enemies on the golf links, with Harry Varden's compliments to James Braid. James Braid is my great hero, and I live pretty much next door to his pro shop, so he's a great chap in my life. And even this evening, just telling you that makes me still go tingly all over. Absolutely amazing. Amazing to think. That's the great thing about books, inscribed books and dedicated books. that the people concerned actually handled this book. There's no flapping about. We know that belonged to Braid, and we know that it was given to him by Varden, and that's Varden's handwriting. I find that pretty exciting. I wouldn't be so excited if that was sort of Nick Faldo or some of the other more modern greats, but that really does turn me on. Another book that he gave me, or no, didn't give it to me, but he sold me, was the Official Golf Guide of 1899. That's the original label, but I think it's got a soft leather binding like the original. I think I had it rebound. But this is American Pensacola, and it's a wonderful book. And 1899 in America, they'd only started to play golf about 5 years before that, 5 or 6 years before that. But they got on with it, and they built these magnificent clubhouses and so on and so forth. And this, would you believe it, was presented to Tom Morris with the compliments of the St Andrews Golf Club in New York, USA, presented by William Agnew Peyton, Governor, St Andrews Golf Club in New York, and he even got his little visiting card. See page 229. So this is hugely exciting for you. So there is page 229, and old Agnew has sort of annotated it. There are a few errors, but the bottom is quite extraordinary, and I think I've got to make, yeah, there we are. It reads, the St Andrews course is primarily for the use of its members and their invited guests. Now remember, this is 1899. The tournament business, 1899, the tournament business, is not encouraged. It interferes too greatly with golfing for golf's sake. W.A. Peyton, Governor. So wasn't that absolutely brilliant? Now, so that's ex-Tom Morris. We know that Tom Morris owned that book, and I find that pretty exciting. This is another one. This is the biographical sketch of the late Lieutenant Colonel Sir Hugh Lyon Playfair, who was the guy who put St Andrews back on the map. He was provost at the university and did everything that was great up here. We'll get on to more detail in just a moment. And there is Sir Hugh Lyon Playfair, and there's the title page. It was published quite a few years after his death, so that is 50, 60, 70, 74, so published in 74, so 13 years after the old boy died. And there's the inscription to Tom Morris, father of the golf, with pleasant... Thank you very much. David Hamilton, my prompter. Yeah. Father of the golf, with pleasant reminiscence of old lang syne, when he and his champion partner, Alan Robertson, brackets of happy memory, engaged in many a tussle in now historic foursomes. So, very exciting that Tom Morris handled this book. And then what I found absolutely fascinating going through it. I haven't got an illustration of it, but let me tell you. So if you went to page 15 of this book, it says here, himself a keen golfer, and knowing how popular the game had been in India, because Playfair, like a lot of those other characters, the East India Company made their fortune, came back here, I think he was aged in his early 40s when he came back and did all this work, but he'd seen how successful golf had been in India. And if you think about it, in the 1830s, golf had sort of, I think that was the time when the Honourable Company had to sell up. And so it says here, how popular the game had been in India. He first of all set about improving the links, which then lay almost an untrodden waste. Brackets, Playfair returned to St Andrews from India in 1834. And fascinating, here we are, the home of golf, actually taking the lead from India. Make what you like of that. I couldn't resist this because having seen Varden writing about Braid, I can't resist sharing this one, written by Taylor about Varden. And I mean, this is extraordinary. This is in a book called The Art of Golf, Simpson's Art of Golf. It's one of the sort of cornerstone books, 1887. Let me read it to you. Let me say, without equivocation, now, I mean, that's not a bad word for somebody who left school at 12, that I consider Harry Vardon to be the best player I ever saw. Allied to his great skill as a golfer, he was the most generous opponent, giving to his adversary full praise for his efforts, which, more often than not, were waged in vain. Now, I got this at a Mullock auction only about 10 years ago for £170. The other punters could not have seen that inscription, and I don't think the auctioneer did either. It's always worth viewing sales, seriously. Yeah, just briefly back to my friend John Weigel. Can you remember that the Woking story? I missed out Gossip of Golf and Golfers. And for years and years I've been waiting to, and one came up which was bought by Patino for sort of, you know, I think something just short of £20,000. And John Weigel's widow, who I kept in touch with, very nice lady, she'd found this little book somewhere in John's effects, where she'd got rid of the whole library, of course. And it was a copy of Historical Gossip of Golf and Golfers. I dreaded that it was going to be the John Lowe copy, because that means that somebody who got that, you know, had profited from it, but it wasn't. And anyway, I gave Jenny very much more than I bought the whole Woking collection for. But it's lovely to have that book, because it is very, very special indeed. Ready for another story? Now, this is the Alan Robertson story, 1997, so this is really modern times. David Sturt, some of you will know, retired surgeon. Henderson and Sturt, Golf in the Making, milestone book, and he wrote a lot of good books, and he became Christie's golf expert, I think, wasn't it? And he went over to Australia and met the last surviving Miss Robertson. Alan Robertson, just reminding you, died early. He was quite young. He wasn't married, didn't have a family. 1859, and of course he was the champion golfer, and it was the members of Press Week decided they had to find out who the next champion golfer was, and hence the Open. But his brother was already in Australia, and he sent all his effects, and that is why, is it Royal Sydney that have got all these feather balls and long-nosed clubs?
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
Royal Sydney, thank you. And anyway, David Sturt tracked down this last surviving Miss Robertson and bought from her the book, and this book is actually mentioned in his will. It was quite a thing for an artisan type like that to own a book, very special indeed, and to be able to read it as well. That's another thing you've got to remember. So there was the book, the tie-pin, and I've got this tie-pin that I got in, is the exact replica, and his snuff box and his penknife. And David Sturt came to see me in 1997, and he didn't come to sell these to me, he was just telling me about it, and the RNA had turned these 4 items down, and the British Golf Museum had, and he didn't want to split them up, he didn't want them to go to auction, and so on and so forth. So after he left, I thought, well, I'm going to try and get that book. So I wrote and I was careful. So he had 4 items, so I was careful. I gave rather more than pro rata for the single item, and explained that, I am a book collector and I would simply love that book. And I know my friend Peter Crabtree would like to buy the other 3 items. And you were happy, weren't you? I've always tried to look after you. Anyway, the thing about this book, now, by the way, he had it bound up, and this is David Sturt, and that was it. I would much prefer to have that book in its original condition. That sort of smart new binding doesn't do anything for me. But having said that, there is so much that's good. Now, Peter did have a scrapbook, or perhaps still has a scrapbook of Alan Robertson, and that was signed. But I don't believe, and well, until another book turns up, that there's any other book signed by Alan Robertson, because people weren't rushing around getting his autograph. That hadn't been thought of. And in this book, there's a slightly restored title page. Right up at the top, you can actually see it indistinct. There are 4 signatures, but take a look at that one. Alan Robertson, Golf, Bank, St Andrews, 1844. And there's another one, Alan Robertson, the links and that, St Andrews. When I went to the World Golf Hall of Fame, they have those paving stones with the signatures, and they've got a paving stone for Alan Robertson, but they don't have a signature. It's quite extraordinarily scarce. Says here, very humbling to be the custodian of such an item. Really, really special. So there are my 7 stories. Can I do the saga, or I hope people have enough? Now, the ongoing saga concerns, that's the letter of authentication from the Miss Robertson. There's just a line of the Badminton Library, and I'm sure everybody knows that. It was the bestseller. It was published from 1890 to 1911. There were a whole series. I think there were 22, 23 different sports. But I suppose I just want to have a word, because you could almost become a collector of the Badminton Library, golf, because there are so many different variations, obviously different editions. I think there were about 5 editions, but you've got, for instance, the deluxe edition, which is what they call in half leather, where you get the spine and the corners. That's the coat of arms of the Duke of Beaufort. You've got the large paper edition, limited to 250, and then you've got the ordinary trade edition to the right. But of course, your collection, if you're going to collect Badminton Library, you've got to be a bit of a completist. You might say, well, if you've got 1 copy. The fact is, the 1911 copy is very different, because it's got all sorts of stuff in there that was in there in 1890. But you can get them inscribed. You see, you can get inscribed and dedicated, and people tuck things into books, and letters get stuck into books. So this is, with the editor's kind regards, B for Beaufort. He was the editor. I can't believe he was actually spending too much time. I think it was edited by sort of patronage more than anything else. But I don't know how many signed copies by Beaufort there are, and that's Easter 1890. So that's an interesting one, an interesting variation. This is Stanley Baldwin's copy, 1890. And you will immediately recognise his, and be able to translate that Latin motto. I was able to find it on Wikipedia. But, now, this is really, really special. This is 1890, but this is the Boston, America edition. Now, I bet you've never seen one of these before. So this is, very often it was said that Lee's Golf in America was the first American golf book. I think more correctly, that was the first book written by an American, but a number of years earlier, that book was published in, and if you think about it, how many golfers were there in America in 1890? So, goodness knows how many books survive of that date and that American publication. So that's a nice variation again. And then our old friend Mort Oldman of the Old Golf Shop, Cincinnati, Ohio, he was always in it for the main chance. And he rebound. Now, how many of these that he rebound, I don't know. So that's his fancy binding on the front. And what we know, and I honestly don't think that he ever realised. I don't think I bought this. He would have charged somebody a huge amount of money for this, and I got it at some later stage. But this was Guy Campbell's copy. Now, Sir Guy Campbell became quite a well-known golf course architect later on, in the 50s and 60s. And we know this is a copy. And then it says, see page 236. And it's the dawn of golf. And it's on the scores, just at the back here. And we now know that that was little Guy Campbell. And what we also know is that the nursemaid looking after him was Ada Philpott, because on the back of that illustration it gives you absolutely chapter and verse about, you know, the cat, the family, and also who the nursemaid was. So that was really, really special, getting that. Oh yes, and the other thing that he did, the 4-edge painting. You know, when the book is closed up and all the edges are in gilt, very often it's just the top edge that's in gilt, and that's there for a good reason, because it's much easier to dust a book if it's got a nice shiny edge. But the skillful thing is they do them, and that is Horace Hutchinson, and of course this Badminton Library was, you know, very largely written by Horace Hutchinson. So when you fan the pages open, it shows a picture. So that's pretty darn special. Good old Walt Ullman. Oh yeah, the next one might even be the last one. No, it's not the last one. So a book fair in London, not, you know, within say 10, 15 years ago, flog around, anything on golf. Oh, he said, well, I've got this, and it was a badminton library, and I think he wanted £45 for it, and the one thing I don't need is another badminton library. So he said, there's a letter in there, stuck on the rear end papers, and that's actually the second page of it, and it's this fellow A.J. Travis Allen thanking his chum for the telegram that he sent upon him winning the championship. And I said, well, I'd never heard of A.J. Travis Allen. And the bookseller, God bless him, he had done his work, and it was only 45 quid. He said, well, he gets a mention in the book. And we go to the appropriate page. And of course, he was the chap who won the championship at Muirfield in 1897. This is the amateur championship, and you've got all those crack golfers. He'd only taken the game up 4 or 5 years previously when he came up to Edinburgh to study medicine. He was at medical school in Edinburgh, took up the game, played in his first ever championship and won it. And the tragic thing is that he got his first job as a doctor, got TB, consumption as I think they called it in those days, and died the following March. So he wasn't able to defend his title. And, you know, the whole thing is completely utterly tragic. And as far as this humble little book collector, all these years later, I have got a signed letter from A.J. Travis Allen, amateur champion 1897, and I'm not sure how many of those there are. So this just came with a humble copy of the Badminton Library. And there he is. And there actually, by public subscription, they raised, and the Reverend John Kerr, a number of you will be familiar, he raised this subscription. It doesn't say where that, I mean, it's clearly somewhere around Edinburgh, but it doesn't actually tell you where it is, as far as I can see. But terribly sad story. I think this might be the last one. So this is signed by the author. So this is to a very promising pupil from the author, Horace Hutchinson, and he was famous for his stickmen. In Hints on Golf, he used these stickmen to illustrate. And again, that's the only signed Horace Hutchinson that I've got. So very pleased to have that. And actually the very, very last one, Mercus the Knot, I mean it's a presentation, so it's nice to have that. But this was, I bought this for a very small amount of money. I can't remember. Anyway, this was the copy that I sold to one of my heroes, John Baharrell, in my book dealing days. You remember he was the youngest winner of the amateur champion in 1956, and he then became captain here. And he was a book collector. And he bought this from me because he'd still left my little reference number in the prize, which was £12.50 in the front of the book. So it's come back to me, and that's, you know, he was a great hero, and he was president of our British Golf Collectors Society. So there was one more actually. Yeah, and this is the last edition, and it's 1911, and it is mint. Right. Thank you very much.